Good evening, everybody. My name is Erica Epstein, and I'm coming to you live tonight. Um, and I hope that you can tune in and listen to our wonderful conversation about learning from observations and assessments. Tonight, I'm bringing you this topic from Family Central Training Academy. On behalf of them, I'm sponsoring the training through them, and I'm going to direct my focus on how we observe and assess children in our classroom environment. And as you can see on the cover of the first slide, there is an assessment cycle, and it starts off by step 1 being observing and collecting facts. Step 2, analyzing and responding. Step 3, evaluating. And step 4, summarizing, planning, and communicating. And it is necessary to follow this assessment cycle because it actually guides us to our next point in which we do our observations and formally assess our children. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, I would like to discuss a little bit about me and how I began my journey in the field of education. I have been a former teacher in New York City's public school system from 1995 till 2008. I've been teaching a long, long time, and I have had the pleasure of working with a vast diversity of cultures and socioeconomic status of children and families. And it is my pleasure to be bringing you this training from the vision that I've had from when I was much younger in my career and going forward into who I blossomed into today. And along the way, after working in the public school system, I moved to Florida about 9 years ago, and I decided to own a preschool with my husband. So we actually ran it together. I was the director for 8 years while we owned the school, and my husband was the financier. And together we made a go of it. We didn't know anything about owning a preschool before that, but we figured I can combine my formal education and he can combine his business savviness and his knowledge, and together we decided to venture into the preschool world. It was definitely a culmination of our life experiences coming into play and not knowing too much about the preschool. I definitely learned right away, and it was quite shocking due to the fact that I had to get used to the environment that I was working in. Although it was similar to the environment in New York City, it definitely had its differences. And one being the most, I would say, diverse for me would be the fact that here in Florida is that they do the VPK early start, and that was a tough pill to swallow because I had to really gear myself to learn all the developmental standards and what went into observing, assessing, and really being able to work side by side with staff, teaching development, curriculum, early stages of growth. So there was a lot of things that, were new to me, and I basically got hands-on experience while owning the preschool. The staff didn't have the same training and skills as New York certified teachers with master's degrees, which was what I have. So I want to talk tonight about one of those skills being assessment and observation. And so I'm going to begin by saying that we define observation as watching to learn. Observing provides the information you need to build relationships with individual children, which enable them to ultimately be successful learners. We learn about our children by carefully watching them, listening to them, studying their work, looking at their habits, and really trying to understand what they are feeling, learning, and thinking. Getting to know children as people and as learners gives us the information we need to make effective decision making in our classrooms. With the information you learn from observing, you can select the right materials, you can plan appropriate activities, and you can ask questions that guide our children in learning to understand the world around them. All children are curious, and all children are going to ask a ton of questions. So we can elicit the learning that goes on between teacher and child through our observing lenses. For example, one child may be an active explorer, intensely curious and imaginative, but you may have another child that might be quiet, taking time to look around before getting involved in play or work. Every child is intrigued by something that ignites their fascination and really provides insight into the essence of that child as a person and a learner. So for one child, it may be music, painting, but for another child, it may be building blocks or something they can't yet imagine, but they can talk about. So tonight, I'm going to start out by asking on my first slide, what is assessment and why do we do it? Obviously, we are mandated by the state of Florida to really push those VPK standards, and we start with infants. We have to observe and assess infants. And that is so important because, as you know, the very early development of children begins in infancy. And early childhood teachers should be versed in assessing children throughout the day, especially since they are involved in their social, emotional, and academic activities. According to NACCE, which is the accreditation body, one of them, that is, national accreditation body, I'm quoting directly from them, that in order to guide for assessment of children, it is the process of observing, recording, and otherwise documenting the work children do and how they do it as a basis for a variety of educational decisions that affect the child, including planning for groups and individual children and communicating with parents. Requires teachers to observe and analyze regularly what the children are doing in light of the content goals and the learning processes. So just from that entire passage, we can understand and have a better idea of how important assessing children would be. And in order to learn more about children, it's not just about the, testing standards that we sometimes push, but it's more or less really trying to dissect why it is so important to learn every facet about a child. And that brings me to my next point. The child should be seen in their natural environment in which they can be themselves. And while observing children can learn through navigating their classroom, this observing is authentic. And why I bolded the word authentic is because in order to observe children, it shouldn't be forced. It should be in a natural environment. No child should ever be told what to do, when to do it, and why they're doing it. It should just be a natural process. When can the teacher find time to observe? Well, I know because I used to teach, and I'm sure those of you that may be watching are probably grinning, making faces, smirking, and trying and finding it very hard to really process this because it is so hard to find time to observe. Between everything that's going on in the classroom and all the expectations placed on us, when do we find time to observe? That is a really good question. So, in order for a teacher to observe, it really requires multitasking and being able to fit all the things we can do and still get through our day and still be able to touch each and every child. And when I mean touch, I don't mean physically, I mean emotionally, cognitively, socially. It's really important that we are able to really meet the children where they're at in their environment, in their natural, everyday environment. Once the teacher has allocated time in the day, the observations can be part of a narrative. And you may say to yourselves, what does that really mean? How can observations be part of a narrative? Well, it's really all about the story that encompasses how the day unfolds or what the child has done within the time they're actively playing. And when I say actively playing, usually actively playing doesn't necessarily mean they have to be engaged in a one-on-one activity or they have to be engaged with their friends. But it really should mean that they are able to be concentrating. They should be able to be merging the ideas that are formulating inside their mind and really displaying that in front of you. And while the child is under the limelight, the teacher is involved in putting theory into practice through the storytelling that happens. So, storytelling is a really important idea because it not only captures what is going on as the day unfolds, but it's more or less being able to really delve inside the child's mind. What is driving them to socialize with Johnny versus Betsy? Why is it that they want to play in the corner? They don't want to play where you necessarily place them. Why is it that they may choose the block area versus the manipulative area? We don't know, but what we could do is we can have these conversations and we can try through our conversations and through our observing lenses to figure out what is making this child tick. What is causing a reason for them to have the story that they have? Okay, so in order to observe, we have to keep records. And keeping records look very different depending on what school you're working at. In the school that I taught, we had to do running records. And at the time when I was teaching in public school, I was actually teaching kindergarten, we did what's called E-class. And E-class was an assessment tool that really went into depth about a child's psyche. It really told me a lot about how the child was developing, starting from their handwriting and then through the way they had conversations with me, the way they would answer questions. And it really helped me to understand how to better formulate a picture of the child that was sitting in front of me. But keeping records and observing children helps us to gain further insight about what their interests are in various centers around the room and to what extent they are engaged. Sometimes you might see a child very shy and very isolating, sometimes sitting aside, cast away from the rest of the group. That observation is really, really important to note, and I stress that because not every child is going to be doing the same thing routinely. Not every child is going to be engaged with other children or with the teacher. And not every child is going to want to listen. But it is important to note that in our record keeping. And it is important to write that down because that in itself tells us a lot. In keeping observations of certain children more than others, the teacher is in tune with the specific behaviors and personality they possess. And like I said, some children are shy. Some children are overly boisterous. Some children don't know when to stop. But again, it's being able to elicit that and create that narrative that I talked about before in composing that sketch on a child. There are different observation styles, as I note here. Running record is one of them. You can do a video or audio recording, and that usually entails feedback. So, for example, I might assess Johnny, and I might say to him, how many blocks can build this tower? And he might say, well, you're going to need a lot. You're going to need like 50. And I might record that conversation because depending on his age, 50 may be to him a large quantity, when in reality, it's not possible to build with the 50 blocks in the room because most of us don't have 50 blocks. Not ordinarily is it easy to find 50 blocks. I know the required amount is a lot greater, but I know that in our preschool, we always had missing blocks and we had blocks scattered all through the room. We had the foam blocks mixed with the wood blocks and vice versa, and it was not easy. But in going back to recording for video and or audio purposes, the reason why we may observe in this fashion is because we want to be able to translate what the child is saying into recorded language. And we want to be able to question the child. So, Johnny, what did you mean when you said you can build with 50 blocks and that's how you can make a tower? Can you show me? I'm not sure I quite understand. And the child may actually take the time and sit there with you and staying curious. That would help the conversation flow. We might observe using photo collages. And in order to use a photo collage, you're going to elicit a lot more conversation and language, and you're going to be able to gather a lot more about the child in that observation style than you would maybe in a different way. You might use a visual display. You might be able to classify objects and say to a child, Mary, can you show me the difference between a a car that, I don't know, that like a sports car versus, a regular sedan type of thing. And, she may relate better because maybe her father drives a sports car and she can point you to the picture. Um, a photo observation. Sometimes it's important to have the children bring in live pictures of their family, of something that is relatable to them. Their favorite food, a pet they may have in their house, something that is important due to, some children may not have the familiarity as far as, objects. So by showing them pictures, you're actually creating that vivid image for them. And at the same time, you're being culturally sensitive because, not every child experiences the same things from their home that maybe another child may experience, you know? And observing through learning stories. Sometimes what I like to do is once I'm reading a story, I'll actually hide the pictures and I'll put post-its on certain parts of the text. And you might be saying, why would I do that? Well, I would do that because I would want to observe how is the child relating to the text? Are they actually picturing the words come alive in their mind? Are they in sync with the language? Is it making sense to them? Is it something that they can actually picture themselves doing? So it's sort of like I like to draw them in and really encapsulate them into the story. And then I can observe whether or not they're actually comprehending and relating to the text and the story. Anecdotal records. In order to be able to observe, sometimes and most of the times I had to as a teacher in elementary school, and I know that my staff in our preschool did it as well. They kept anecdotal records because it really helped to distinguish different patterns of behaviors throughout the day. That's one reason. But also, it also translated into a story. For example, if, say, Michelle comes to school one morning and she seems rather off. We don't know why she seems off, but we know that her normal behavior is to be excited to come to school, to run and hug her friends, to greet the teacher, to go to her familiar centers. But today she seemed off. So it's important to keep an anecdotal record because this may actually give us an idea as to why Michelle may not be doing well that morning. Maybe something happened prior to being dropped off at school. Maybe something happened while she came to school in the morning after her mother dropped her off. But in order to go back in time, it's important to keep anecdotal records. Checklists. We can observe by either creating our own checklists, or we may have a more formalized, standardized checklist in which we just check the boxes. Was Johnny able to keep his head up throughout the day? Was Johnny able to pay attention and engage with his peers? So those would all be checkable or not. And then reflections. So reflections, when we talk about observation styles, would be to really think back as to why would this child be acting this way, perhaps? Or maybe the child is having a bad day, and I might want to observe and think about how can I reflect on this child's day in terms of his overall progress. So I may want to draw upon and elaborate into a bigger picture of the child. So that requires reflection. So reflections are just as the word sounds, being able to look into a child deeper and to go that step further as to what is going on with this child and how do I put and translate what I'm observing from what I'm seeing onto paper, what I'm actually writing about. What do observations tell us? Well, observations tell us a lot of things. When you observe, you slow down, you listen to a child more carefully, you pause to reflect before stepping in to offer some direction or a helping hand. But you also see and respond to who a child is and what a child needs. Observing helps us build relationships by revealing the uniqueness of every child. And when I say uniqueness, it's not just what their interests are, such as building with blocks, but it tells me more. It tells me about the child's temperament, what the child's strengths are, their personality, their work style, and their preferred mode of expression, right? And that goes back to being shy, being boisterous, being loud, being quiet. Okay, so also observing helps us to assess their developmental and functional levels. For example, throwing a ball but not being able to vary the throw being hard or soft. Okay, so it helps me as the educator know at what point is Johnny able to execute his developmental functioning. And that's really important because in the scheme of things, that relates back to figuring out how does Johnny progress. But observations also tell us what strategies children use to develop and reach their goals. For example, we as teachers need to listen closer to our children. But children need to listen closer so they can follow directions and not be easily distracted, right? So it's a give and take. Being able to observe what it is that we're hoping to accomplish, but also being able to get something from the child as well. It also helps us know what skills the child needs to practice and continue to improve. So for example, maybe a child needs further help in beating a shoestring. Or maybe they just need some assistance. Whatever the case may be, that really helps us to drive further instruction. And when we are dealing with multiple personalities, because in our classrooms, it completely varies from one child to the next, we're learning about who they are and what stimulates their growth. So for example, if a child is shy, does that make them unlearnable? Or does that actually tell me Okay, I'm back, and I hope that that helped. But if it didn't, if you can just jot down a little note letting me know if you're able to see or hear or not. Okay, so I'm going to answer Michelle's question. Your question was, how do we create the classroom community so every child feels welcome and can get busy doing things so I have the chance to observe them? Okay, so that is a loaded question, because in order to create a classroom community so every child feels welcome, that actually corresponds to another training that I have planned, which is actually talks about classroom rituals and morning greeting times, and being able to invite children so that they can create a community of togetherness and be able to promote that in our classroom, which is also facilitated obviously by the teacher. But when we put that burden on our children, we're actually teaching them to become successful, and we're setting them up for that growth. So in order to create a community of learning and welcoming them to our environment in our classrooms, um, while you're observing and while you may be busy doing a million different things and multitasking, it's really important that you divide up the responsibilities that you have on you as the teacher with your assistant, perhaps, versus what the children's responsibilities are. And oftentimes, we don't like to assert ourselves in the classroom and give out responsibilities to our children, but actually, they love it. And that in itself takes the pressure off of us. Because, as I said before, observations and assessments should be done authentically, should never be forced, should be in a natural environment, and it should be given, it should be done in a way in which helps the child understand their environment better. And only you as the teacher can really shape that environment. And you can bring awareness to the children of what their expectation is from you as the teacher and what your role is and where their role fits in with yours. And I hope that answers your question. Okay, so we're going to continue, but obviously if anybody has any questions, feel free to write in and I will try to answer them as I'm going through the PowerPoint. I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay, the pace of observing. Now, in order to time the way we observe, we have to realize that there's a lot of detail that goes into observing. And there's a lot of required checklists and a lot of required documentation that we need to have in order to accurately observe and assess. So we need to figure out what goes into theory that helps to sort out our objectives, right? So if we have a clear picture of a child and we have all of the assessment tools available to us, then only then can we realize our objectives and what we're setting out to do. And one feeds into the other. So if I go back to the beginning, I know the observation cycle that I showed you guys at the beginning, where one leads to the next one, to the next one. There's four arrows in which they're all interconnected. Can I go back? So let me just show you real quick. Okay, so in the assessment cycle, at the beginning, I told you that first we're observing and we're collecting facts. So that's, we're really gathering data on the child. We're really figuring out what is the child doing? How is the child doing what they're supposed to be doing? Step 2 would be analyzing and responding. So not only are we observing and collecting facts, but now we're analyzing, we're going deeper. We're responding to what we're actually processing. Step 3 would be evaluating, like being able to figure out how is the child reaching their potential or their growth. And the last step, step 4, being summarizing, planning, and communicating. So in that assessment cycle, we're really honing in on that narrative, and we're really getting the actions in rich detail. Sometimes by keeping at a certain pace, we are allowing the natural process to happen, thereby being speculative or not from the child's perspective of thought processes. So in other words, if we are regulating ourselves and we're letting things just happen, then we're actually capturing the child in their thought processes. So they may be even thinking out loud. They may be saying certain things. They may be making comments. They may be, shouting or saying these babbling words that we may not understand, but that is their cycle of thought. For example, a child is observed performing a gross motor task. What is that child doing that you don't notice? Why would that child be doing it that way? What are some theories that drive your assumptions? What are some of the child's thoughts that hold deeper meaning? All of those questions you may or may not be able to answer. But what's most important about the pace of being able to observe that child is being able to notice and taking that moment to capture what it is that the child is actually doing. And why is the child doing it in the first place? So all these questions and all this data finding and fact finding are going to help us in the long run because we're compiling a bigger picture on a child. What may come out of pacing? Okay, so in order to know how we are doing, we have to check in with ourselves. We have to say, how is it that because I'm doing the observing and the child is doing the action, how do I know that I am crossing paths with that child? So, in order to best answer that, there has to be a form of communication. And thought-provoking questions, such as the ones that you see here on the screen, are the exact type of questions that will embed our thinking along with what the child is actually doing. So some questions could be, hey Johnny, why did you hop with one foot? What made you decide to use 1 foot instead of 2? Last time you used 2 feet to get from point A to point B. What made a difference to you this time? Staying curious, being able to articulate questions, being able to have the responses and really understand why the child is doing what he is doing will really help us. And I can't stress that enough. But in conclusion, our theories may delineate a response that taps into their theory. So we may have a theory about the child, and we may not be sure that we're accurate. We may be making assumptions. But at the end of the day, we're probably tapping into their knowledge and their curiosity and their experiences, which is really what this is all about. Okay, so before I asked you to jot down a child's name, one in which you would say you observe in your classroom, one of which may or may not be familiar to you. But in order to learn more about our children in our class, what are some of the questions do you think about the children with whom you work? How can you best observe them? How can you best get to know them? And I don't mean by just asking them, any out of the blue questions. I mean, there should be intentional questions. They should be motivating for the child to want to be able to communicate and share with you. So, some examples, even though I didn't put them in this PowerPoint, would be really the best way to gather information and use what you can from what the child tells you would really be to get inside their world. So you might want to say, um, how many of you have, siblings? And you can start a whole conversation about it. Well, do you guys get along? How do you know you get along? What are some of the things you do with your sibling? How do you show your sibling that you're angry with them? When do you feel the most happiest when you're with your sibling? So, being able to ask them about their family members always gets them involved in one way or another. You might also want to get to know your children by finding out what their interests are. You might say to them, "What is your favorite sport?" And you might notice that a child's eyes are going to light up. Then you know you really struck it big. Because when you have that child in your presence and you know that you really have captivated them, it makes the opportunity all the more worthwhile. You're able to get to observe what they're telling you, to read through their expressions and their body language. And then you're able to put that on paper. And then you can reference back to it and you can say, I see that you're really upset now. Would maybe inviting your sister one day to come and you know, either play with you or share something about your family, would that help you feel better right now? Or you can pose it in a different way. But that is really going to help you to, to really get to know the children in your classroom. And so when we use observations for planning, we want to make sure that we plan goals according to their age, the stage of development, and the needs of the child, right? Because otherwise it's, purposeless. We don't have a purpose. And we also want to make adjustments based on the continual needs of the child. So, for example, 2 months ago, Johnny, emotionally may not have been ready to separate from his mother upon being dropped off at school. But today he could. And so his needs or his growth has improved. So he's able to regulate his emotional expressions. He may be able to separate and disconnect from that bond that he felt so strongly about 2 months ago. So adjustments are always going to be made on the continual needs of the children. When considering progress made from observations, it is highly crucial that a child's strength is factored in, not necessarily their weaker areas. So what I mean by that is when you know that a child has developed from where they came from a month ago, you want to make sure to record their strengths. You want to focus on those factors, not on what they could be doing better, but you really want to be able to accurately describe how they have made those strides and capture that in writing. And also, just as a side note, when you do plan to meet with their parents, you should always have a strong list of positiveness and strengths to elicit to express to parents and to really magnify, because by not focusing in on a child's strength, sometimes it can be devastating to the progress that the child will be able to make in your classroom. And it may be subconscious. It may be something that you may not be aware of as a teacher, but somehow, some way, the child got that message. So focusing in on the strengths is really important. Okay, it's soon coming up to 1 hour. It's 7:25, and we're going to take a 5-minute break shortly. I want to finish with this slide, and I'm going to give you a chance to write any questions down. But let me just finish this. The base of the observation should be, but not always is, strictly to gauge a child's overall growth. So in order to make sure that we're intentionally planning when we observe our children, we should always be assessing for their overall growth. We shouldn't just, stop at one thing just because, let's say, a question is short-sighted and it doesn't really, go into great detail. If we have more to say about something, we should really be able to write that down. We should really be able to observe it, notice it, share it on paper, and also it's fair to say that we should compliment our children, because sometimes it's not just what you see as the teacher, but it's also what you do with the information that you are observing. So sharing that piece of information with a child by offering a compliment goes a long way. Okay, I'm going to stop now. Like I said, it's 7:26. We're going to break for 5 minutes and we're going to reconvene. Okay, everybody, I'm back. So I hope that you were able to reflect a little bit on some of the information that I brought to you. And like I said before, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and ask me on the chat. Um, so otherwise, I'm going to continue because I don't see any questions. And I'm going to just make a little analogy of observing before I move to my next slide, because I know that I didn't put this in my PowerPoint, but I think it's important to emphasize that when we are seen as observers in the classroom, we're like, an observation is sort of like being a photographer. It captures a moment in time. So just like a photographer focuses in on getting the right picture and making sure that, the perception is there and the obscurity or the clarity is there, so do we have that same obligation when we perform the act of observing. We never want to eliminate the personal side of observing, um, nor would we want to, because it is it's coming from our own self as far as what we're observing, and it's shaping how we see our children and families, which in turn affects our relationships with them. So I just wanted to make you guys aware of that point, and just kind of make you aware of the fact that being able to observe children's behaviors and their thinking processes along the way is really going to help you to shape your curriculum, shape what you have to teach the children, and it really will be able to dissect the information for you and give you at the end more clarity as far as how you are to work with the children that you have in your care. So what does the research on child development reveal, which includes children's milestones and misconceptions? Well, conveying meaning may sometimes not be adequate through a child's eyes. They often blame the listener for failing to understand them. So what I mean by that is sometimes when we actually observe and assess our children, what they're trying to convey to us is not sometimes what our perception may be of the child. And, sometimes that could be misleading because we may see them one way when oftentimes they may be they may be showing a different side. And then we may jump to conclusions, and then we may start to think of our children as, let's say, having developmental issues or behavioral issues, or, just all these things run through our minds. But it's really important that we are able to understand and get it down as to what the standard domains of knowledge entail, meaning the what, the why, the how, the when. And why I say that is because that is what fuels our conversations with children. That is what embodies the culture that we develop and we cultivate with our children. If we do not have that in our classroom, then there's something lacking within the way that we're developing relationships. And it's really easy for the child to not open up to a teacher that doesn't exude that warmth or doesn't exude that back and forth, question answer type of relationship. Milestones and misconceptions are clear to the observer, and the details in the knowledge of that domain are explored to best understand the child. So, in order for us to best be able to know when our children are reaching the milestones that they set out to, and they're accomplishing whatever the knowledge of that domain is, we need to really explore that child. We need to, like I said before, dig deeper and figure out what is the child capabilities? What is their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What can we improve upon? What can we do in order to help the child further so that they can actually develop appropriately and they can achieve success? Okay, so I'm going to, I know it says let's break for a short quiz. We did that already. We broke, so we're not going to break again. But this picture over here, I ask a question about this child, and I wanted to really have you figure out what developmental milestone is this child showing us. And the reason why I ask this question is because when you look at it, when you look at the picture very, quickly, you see a child holding a baby doll. And you don't see anything more than that. And I think it's important to point out that this is a social and emotional context in which the child is doing something with that doll. The way that she's responding to the doll, the way that she's holding the doll, the way that she's coming into eye contact with the doll. Okay, that is really telling as far as where this child is meeting her developmental milestone. So would you say A, she's repeating sounds or gestures for attention? We don't know if she's making any sounds. We don't know if she's talking to the doll. Would you say B, that she's recognizing names of familiar people, objects, and body parts? Well, seems to me that she's looking right in the doll's eyes, so seems to me that it would be fair to say that she does recognize this doll and this object and knows exactly where to look. C, plays make-believe with dolls, animals, and people. And D, spontaneously shows affection for familiar playmates. Okay, I want you guys to write in, those of you that are listening, as far as where do you think this development milestone in this child, what is she showing us? I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about it, and we'll talk about it. Okay, so two of you I see said C, that the little girl is playing make-believe with her doll, animals, and people. And one of you said B, that she does recognize the name of familiar people, objects, and body parts. Okay. I just want to know, why did the two of you choose letter C? If you could just write in and tell me. Okay, well, for those of you that chose C, you are absolutely correct. She is playing make-believe with her doll, and I'm just curious as to why you chose C. Okay, somebody wrote for affection, to show affection. Um, okay, so basically the developmental milestone would be that she's showing affection. Okay. Um, I'll tell you why I would think that C is correct. I think that C is correct because the child is not just showing affection, but she's clearly illustrating the attachment she has with the doll. So you can see the connection. You could see it in her eyes. You could see it in her face. You can see the way she's relating to the doll. Those are all developmental milestones. And if we are on the sidelines as teachers, peeking at this child performing this gesture or playing with this doll, we may not capture this important milestone. We may take it for granted and we may say, oh, this child, she does it every day. We kind of might just brush it off. But it's really important that we get a sense of how this child is relating to the doll. What in her world tells her to feel safe in order for her to convey, communication to this doll or to speak to the doll. Maybe there's some language going on here that, we might be able to detect. Maybe there's that connection that she sees being modeled in her home between her mom and her sister or between her mom and her dad. Whatever the case may be, it's really important that we're able to go beyond sometimes what's in front of us. And I think that's the point that is most important to share tonight. When we do our assessment and when we do our observations, there's so much greater depth in which we need to explore as teachers. It's not just the surface. It's not just the little moments, the little sparkly moments that maybe we capture here or there, but it's actually what the child does in order to act upon their impulses, or what is the deeper meaning here. So I want you to really, hopefully, from this training, you'll be able to implement some of these ideas and take them back into your classroom and actually dig a little bit deeper so that you could really gather this important message that I'm sending you tonight. Okay, documentation. So in order for us to document everything that we've now taken from our observations, from our assessments, we have to make sure that we're able to understand the research we accomplished when a child completes multiple step activities. So documentation is really helpful and is key in the sense that we have to, once we put everything in writing, that is when we really know that, our fact finding is what we say it is. It's just the spoken word, and it's what we see coming into play. The thinking that a child projects when trying to work out the kinks should be noted when observing. The research will enable early childhood educators to compile a bigger picture of the child and what those accomplishments translate to. So again, documentation is definitely another step in the direction of helping us to complete that snapshot that we have of our children. And if we didn't write it, that means we didn't see it. So If we didn't see it, we should be writing it. And I think that is also the important part about being able to keep records, to be able to document what it is that we find important. And sometimes what you may not find important, maybe the state would find important and our accreditation body might find important. So it really is just a matter of being able to convey what it is that we are seeing and what is happening in our classroom and translating that into, a written document. Okay, I see here that somebody wrote, um, okay, that the child shows imagination over loving people like real life. That's absolutely true. That is definitely going back to the slide. I'm just going to go back. When you wrote that the child is expressing their imagination, so we can probably think about fantasy versus reality, right? Isn't that a developmental milestone when a child is able to realize that they are doing something that is real versus something that isn't, something that's imagined? Being able for the child to show her doll love, I think really emphasizes the emotion that she's trying to convey here. And it's really, she's speaking to that emotion, which I think is a very good point what you wrote. So I just wanted to say that's absolutely correct. Um, okay, and okay. Um, so the importance of observations and assessments. Okay. Um, to reiterate, this is all about observing and assessing and the importance of it and what we do with it. We can't, when we observe and assess, it just can't be measured by simple conversation or testing that could be state required. The concept that may be familiar is teaching to the test, which is a disservice to children. And as you guys know, I'm sure, when children get into older grades, much higher grade levels, that is always the stigma of being able to teach for the test and being able to assess and having that drill in order for our children to be successful. Well, even though it may be a sliver of the truth, it's not the entirety of the truth. Um, so keeping in mind that when we observe and assess, um, we we really do know our children the best. We can vouch for what they can or can't do, how they play, what skills they apply, and what is developmentally appropriate. Um, Only we can determine that, right? So um, we're able to know our children and we're able to help them to grow and develop. And because we have them sometimes in our presence more than sometimes their own family, we're able to see those, teachable moments or those blossoming growth spurts that they may have. And what's really important to note here is that, anytime a child does something in which they accomplish and they're proud of, and they come running to you and tell you, hey, I know how to tie my shoe, or I went on the potty this morning, or, I was good and I got a star on my, behavior checklist, or whatever the case may be, that is something that really needs to be noted, not just for making the child happy or for the sake of, keeping the child in that positive mode, but I think it also enhances the relationship and it builds on that piece that, sometimes we forget about and sometimes we kind of push it aside and say, you know, oh, that's great, and, you kind of change the topic, or you tend to somebody else that's trying to get to you. But I think it's important that we stop and we take notice of those, moments that sometimes we don't get back. Assessment and, and observations are the most integral pieces of early education that we as teachers acquire from children. And I think it is the most integral piece because it speaks to what we get to know from our children. Our children teach us every day. Even though we may be the teachers, they teach us in leaps and bounds. They're able to come to us and say, remember when you taught us this, or remember when we went here, on a field trip, or whatever the case may be. Those are the important components in which, that is a definitely a momentous piece of growth and accomplishment, and in terms of their social and emotional development. That's the connection that we should never lose. And we should always try to expand on it. Um, and when we speak about culture, we all have a set of beliefs about ourselves, and, we have, as well as attitudes and assumptions and expectations about people and things around us. Sometimes we're not even aware of it. But basically, I think it's important to make note that in order to define culture, that in our classroom, that is, I'm quoting from an anthropologist named Ward Goodenough. He defines culture as a set of standards or rules for perceiving, believing, acting, and evaluating others. It's really important that we bring cultural awareness into our observations, and we really reflect upon how we communicate with children. What is our expectation versus what is, say, the world that they grow up in when they go home? And I think it's important to, really think about that, because sometimes, when you have these expectations of the children in your care and you get frustrated because they're just not getting it, or they may miss the mark in understanding something you're trying to show them or teach them, it's not so much a reflection of you as the teacher. Sometimes it's where they come from. And most of the times we don't consider that. And I think it's really important to say that we need to, because we need to figure out how, holidays may be celebrated to them. Maybe they don't celebrate the same holidays. Maybe they don't eat the same food. Maybe they don't dress the same way that is the norm, quote unquote. We need to realize that how we observe, what we observe, and how we assess influences the how we expect people to behave, or how we expect our children to behave, and how we interpret that behavior. And that's something that's key, because sometimes when we see our children behaving differently from what we expect, or we misinterpret their behavior, we feel confused, we feel frightened, and then it just kind of like escalates, and we think negatively, and we treat them differently. And is that really fair? So I think all of these are important to note in our observing and assessing across the board. And I can go on and on about how we should really think about our children in terms of the way they were raised from a very early age. Did they come from a household that was, secure and loving? Did they hear their parents fight? Are they demonstrating that in the classroom? Are they acting out as a result of what they see in their home? We oftentimes don't give that consideration. And sometimes it's just going beyond, the minutia of the 5 minutes that we may decide we want to give, like a not a timeout, but like a time away type of thing for a child. We really need to figure out, why is this child acting the way they act, before we go and jump to conclusions. So I think that is where our observations and our assessments of our children lie. So in summary, observing helps teachers slow down. We are engaged with them. We should be engaged with them instead of teaching at them. That's really important, because when you're engaged with your children, you are seeing them in a different way. You're not, teaching at them. You're not throwing things directly in their face, meaning you're not saying, well, why don't you know the shapes? Why don't you know the colors? We did this yesterday. You're not expecting these, unbelievably, unrealistic expectation. You're actually treating them like you would want to be treated, and you would want to treat your own children. So we're not teaching at them, but we're engaging with them. We're also, in observing, we're also helping to get to know a child better. We're appreciating them, and we're intervening in ways that enable children to be successful learners. So we're not, we're trying to figure out if there is a problem, or there is a common thread of, what is causing anxiety in a child, or why is this child, unruly. We need to figure out what it is that we can do to better serve our children and to set them up for success. Assessing a child helps you to become an intentional observer while noticing patterns and obtaining a more complete picture of the child. So when we assess, we need to make sure that we are intentionally observing something. We're not just saying, okay, I checked it off on my list and I got it done and I'm good for the day. No, we need to figure out, is this a steady pattern? Is this a behavior to expect based upon, an anecdotal from previous, a month ago? Is there growth? Is there delay? We're gathering data. We're figuring out what is driving this child. How can they get from point A to point B? And do it in a way that really speaks to them. And we're also, when we assess, we also help to determine how a child went about a task, the child's interest level, whether the child work alone or with peers, and what else is happening at the same time. So we're trying to figure out their world. We're trying to figure out what is, let's say, the similarities and the differences, between this child and that child, and where do they fit in that continuum of development. And I think it's really, again, just to hit upon culture. And, I think it's important to understand that just because we have certain attitudes and beliefs and expectation, and that's what shapes us as a teacher, doesn't necessarily mean that jives with the children that we teach every day. And so it's important to really make sure that we have that insight, and it doesn't conflict and it doesn't influence our thinking in ways that could become negative or could take a different turn. It's important to slow down. It's important to, really grasp, as far as have a good grasp as to how a child functions on the level that they're at. What does it mean for that child to be at that level? How does it fit into the scheme of things in the classroom? And what can you gather from the parents? You may want to ask the parents, hey, um, could you tell me a little bit more about how you do things at home? I want to really understand Johnny, because when they're in my care, I see them do this. Do you see that too at home? Being able to stay curious and ask the parents questions can never hurt. It actually opens up the dialogue and really helps to understand why a child acts a certain way, and what shapes their behavior, and things of that nature. But I don't know if anybody had any other questions. Um, Let me see here. I'm checking in. Okay. So Michelle asked this question. I'm going to read it out loud for everyone to hear. If a child has conquered a task, should we ask them to help other children? Okay. If a child gets something quickly, they may get bored, then act out. Likewise, if they don't get something, they may get embarrassed and act out. That's a very good point. So it's quite a question, and it takes on many different answers, just because it's kind of like three questions in one. Let me start with the first question. So, if the child has conquered a task, should we ask them to help other children? So, first of all, I would ask, at what age are you speaking to? What age level is this? Is it preschool? Is it, 3-year-old? I would certainly have the child that has finished the task help their peers, because actually modeling positive behavior is contagious, and it does spread to other children. So when you have one child working on something and they're done, you do want to pair them with other children, because then it creates the desire, creates motivation in children to want to, get the task done. And it actually motivates a child that may be unwilling to get a task done. So why not pair the child that has the task accomplished, pair that pair that child with, a child that may be disengaged. Um, if a child gets something quickly, they may get bored, then act out. Likewise, if they don't get something, they may get embarrassed and act out. Okay, so I think to speak to that answer, if you notice that you've given an assignment or a task or an activity to a child that is quick to get something done, then I would question you as the teacher, rather than just thinking about how fast the child could accomplish that task. Because sometimes we often do things that we're not aware of, or we may not be thinking things through. For example, if this was a VPK class, and let's say you gave them a task such as, making a collage of, you know, um, pictures in their environment that, let's say, they can use their five senses, so they have to find pictures in a magazine or a newspaper that you've spread out on a table, in which, they can see, taste, smell, hear, feel. Um, so let's just say that's the activity, and one child gets it done really fast and, just cuts them out, pastes them on a piece of paper, and says, I'm done. Um, I would I would really speak to yourself. I would really want to question yourself as far as, did you reach this child in the way that their learning capabilities are? Meaning, not every child is going to be able to pick up this activity and complete it so fast. This is that's a pretty detailed activity for a 4-year-old to accomplish. So I would think to myself, did I engage this child long enough? Is this child, frustrated with himself because he really doesn't understand the activity? Why is this child being, getting this activity done so fast? So it's more about you than it would be about the child. And if you also notice that they may act out because they don't get something and they may get embarrassed, well, that is an opportunity to create a learning moment, a teachable moment where you can say, I see that, first, obviously, you would start with the positive and you would compliment them on attempting to do the task and say, hey, Johnny, I noticed that you really tried hard to find pictures in a magazine. Um, but I also noticed that, you may have not cut out the pictures that, I was asking you to cut out. So I would kind of say, "Oh, you see, come look at Angela's paper." So it's not like you're calling the child out on what they did wrong, but rather you're drawing up an example of something he can do better by looking at his peers' paper. So in that case, the child doesn't feel embarrassed and doesn't, suffer from, let's say, low self-esteem or feel like they're any less Okay, so the question was, where do you get the certificates? And wherever you registered for the training is probably where you obtain the certificate. Um, and that would be from Family Central. So, um, anybody have any other questions? I just want to also mention that I will be doing 6 more trainings um, with every week, same time, Wednesday evenings at 6:30. The next one is scheduled for July 26th. The next one would be August 7th. I'm sorry, August 2nd. And, those topics are, very informative as well. If you can join me, that would be great. Um, and last chance, if there's anybody that has any other questions. I see some people typing. I'll give you a few moments. So like I said, I'm going to be giving some more presentations on some of the topics, such as uh, being able to have effective transitions, um, preschool language development, peaceful classrooms, parents as partners, how to get there, quality of feedback, who's doing the talking, preschool language development, all relating to preschool and the environment and how we can create, just like tonight, a community of learners. So I'm going to wait one more moment until we finalize and end this segment for tonight. I want to thank everybody for participating, and I hope that I brought you some informed information, and you can actually take this back to your classroom, and you can reflect on what it is that I was able to convey to you. Um, do we print out our certificates? Um, Again, that's probably not a question I can answer. I'm sure if you went to the person you registered or you spoke with that person, they can tell you that. I would assume that you will get your certificates once, you are done with this training segment, and I'm sure they'll be able to help you. I want to thank everybody for listening to me tonight, and I hope that I was able to help in explaining observations and assessments.